In this video, we will dive into one of the most brutal wars ever fought. From voracious battles on steep jungle hills to the bomb streets of Saigon, this epic struggle between two ideologies is a dark chapter of the 20th century. Of course, there are many dark chapters, but this one is just really bad. For those who fought in it, not for you. You are just chilling watching a video. Good for you. Anyway, back to the dark chapter bit, also known as the Vietnam War, a 20-year-long struggle between a bunch of communist jungle folks and the South Vietnamese government who were getting a bit of help from the United States. Because, well, they did not like communists a lot back then, just like they don't really like them today. The origin of the Vietnam War goes back to the Indochina conflicts of the 1940s and 50s, and the broader Cold War tensions between the US and Russia. First, Japan was fucking around, occupying the country and being a brutal maniac, like they were doing all over Asia until the end of World War II. Soon after the mayhem, the French Indochina War broke out, with France desperately fighting for control over the Indochina territories. After fighting a long battle at Dien Bien Phu, the French surrendered because, well, why am I explaining this? Because they're French. Subsequently, Vietnam was divided into North Vietnam and the state of Vietnam at the 17th parallel, which is a line that runs around the globe somewhere. The newly installed premier of the South Ngo Dinh Diem did a great job suppressing communist activities, and the Americans gave him a big thumbs up for that. One problem with that was that Diem was extremely suspicious about anyone outside his own family. That made the whole governing structure corrupt and the locals a bit scared and unhappy. The local communists, now called the Viet Cong, had little trouble building a new fan base out of those scared and unhappy locals. The Americans called out Diem's failure and gave him a thumbs down instead. Not wanting to look like an incompetent arsehole, the American President John F. Kennedy committed more US support to South Vietnam in 1962 and encouraged Diem to be less of an incompetent arsehole himself. Nevertheless, Diem's bizarre family situation with his brother smoking opium all day and his brother's wife acting like a total to the Buddhist majority were causing instability. The North Vietnam troops fought under the leadership of Ho Chi Minh, a guy who had his pubic hair transplanted onto his chin. The North Vietnamese soldiers and the Viet Cong, led by Pubic Chin Minh, were now occupied in a guerrilla war against South Vietnam. Now Buddhist resistance groups were adding fuel to the fire, surprisingly literal. Eventually, an armed uprising overwhelmed Diem's security forces, and he was shot and killed, together with his brother. Kennedy did not have a lot of time to process what happened because 3 weeks later he was shot and killed himself, while his assassin, Lee Oswald, was shot 2 days later. Lyndon B. Johnson succeeded John F. Kennedy because, well, he was the only person left that wasn't shot. Another question emerged: could Johnson save Vietnam from a hostile communist overtake? When a US destroyer exchanged fire with a North Vietnamese torpedo boat, Washington's finger pointed to North Vietnam as the aggressor. Oh, and they finger pointed back, of course. Subsequently, the US began to bomb strategic installations in North Vietnam itself. The Viet Cong retaliated multiple times until also Johnson started to look like an incompetent arsehole. Ultimately, the US started to deploy ground troops to South Vietnam. Well, this is the part where the real shit show began. US troops themselves were now moving deeper into the Vietnamese jungle looking to find some trouble. Well, they found more trouble than they were probably willing to chew. The terrain itself proved an equal challenge to fighting the Viet Cong, with many parts of the jungle being virtually impregnable. Also, the humid climate combined with the hot temperatures exhausted the soldiers. You could lose more blood being covered in leeches than fucking bullet wounds. Of course, the real nasty part of the ordeal was the countless booby traps placed by the Viet Cong. One step forward by a soldier could result in the following outcomes: bamboo spikes in the bottom of your foot, bamboo spikes in the side of your foot, bamboo spikes in the side of your leg, bamboo spikes in the side of your chest, bamboo spikes into your skull, bamboo spikes into your friends. But don't worry, this is just the bamboo part. An unfortunate leap into a snake pit was not uncommon, including many tripwires for grenades on the floor or in the trees. Ducking down for any incoming rounds could be tricky as well, since rounds of ammo were also buried in the jungle floor set to fire on impact. A hornet nest as a weapon sounded like something out of a comic book, but this device was also a legit booby trap used by the Viet Cong. If you were one of the lucky ones not to get caught in the world's most creative and macabre assault course, then don't forget about the potential you as a soldier had to just step on a mine, which almost sounds boring at this point. To participate in this element of psychological warfare, the US set up the MACV-SOG unit, a military group responsible for covert operations. These guys carried out some very weird missions. During Operation Eldest Son, SOG operatives placed booby-trapped ammunition into Viet Cong weapons stockpiles. Making mortar rounds detonate prematurely and AK ammo explode inside the rifles when fired, which could be a bit annoying for the enemy. Probably the most bizarre mission of the entire war was Ghost Tape number 10. During the dark jungle nights, a US helicopter would circle Viet Cong positions. Mounted loudspeakers would blast the enemy with the sounds of a lamenting ghost from a dead Viet Cong soldier, warning his Viet Cong friends below of his pain and sorrow for dying in the jungle far away from his family. So, yeah, they did that. By 1969, there were more than 500,000 US troops in Vietnam. With the launch of the Tet Offensive, the Viet Cong hoped to capture many towns and cities in South Vietnam, therefore forcing a withdrawal of American troops. This did not happen. For all the trouble US soldiers found in the jungle, they made good by fighting a coordinated battle in the urban areas. All the efforts did not seem to matter. Supplies and men lost by the Viet Cong were easily replaced by reinforcements from Cambodia, Laos and North Vietnam via a supply road called the Ho Chi Minh Trail, or Pubic Chin Minge Trail. More bombs were dropped on this road than the US used against Germany and Japan in World War II, which means they used a lot of fucking bombs on the road. They killed and wounded more than 58,000 Viet Cong soldiers. This would sound like something President Johnson could brag about, but not when you try to convince your people that victory is in sight. A sight blocked by a pile of 58,000 Viet Cong corpses that you promised would not be there in the first place. After the Tet Offensive, which was a huge military success for the American army, Johnson and his government did not look like a bunch of incompetent arseholes anymore. They looked like a bunch of lying arseholes instead, which is not a great improvement when you are fighting a war as a democracy, especially a democracy with something called free press. So, when you claim the war is going well, the TV shows dead American soldiers instead. Or when you claim you are rebuilding Vietnam and the TV shows you a local village going Pompeii mode by a napalm cloud, or when you say victory is in sight and, well, we don't have to mention those 58,000 Viet Cong corpses again, but we just did. As a result, large crowds of angry protesters were now taking to the streets to protest the war. Johnson announced he would not run for re-election, which was not a lie for a change. Promising to end the war and restore trust from a deeply divided nation, Richard Nixon was elected as the 37th president, committing a little bit of treason on his way by trying to influence the peace talks between Hanoi and Saigon before getting elected. Johnson found out but became too chicken shit to say anything about it, which is not a great way to gain anyone's trust, let alone from an entire nation. With the peace talks bogged down, thousands of soldiers were still getting killed on each side in what looked like an endless and senseless war. If things were not bad enough, the American public found out about My Lai, a small South Vietnamese village visited by an American army unit who turned into a bunch of Gestapo-frenzied psychos that brutally tortured, raped and murdered everyone and everything they ran into. Mid-1969, more and more American troops started to withdraw from South Vietnam in a process called Vietnamization. The US military failed to stop the communist forces in Vietnam. But they were now supplying the South Vietnamese army with military equipment to do what? Exactly that thing they couldn't do themselves. Instead, the Americans started another bombing campaign around Hanoi, calling it the Christmas bombings, making the killing of another 1,600 civilians sound uncomfortably cheerful. The imminent American retreat out of Vietnam was not called a retreat, but was labeled part of a peace agreement. This way, the US did not look like a total arse. When North Vietnam violated the agreement on all fronts, no pun intended, and Saigon ultimately fell to the North Vietnamese forces in spectacular fashion, the US looked kind of like, well, a total arse.